Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to wait a few minutes for everyone who signed up to actually trickle in, you know how it is. And while we're doing that, we thought maybe we could run a few polls, break the ice a bit, get to know each other a little bit better. So William, I don't know if you're ready, but can we get the polls going now, perhaps? Great, thank you so much. That's very speedy. So, so as you can see, we're asking something about the blocker to your L&D team keeping up with the pace of change. And that's something that Michelle and I are going to be speaking to throughout the course of this webinar. Really interested to see all your answers to this. I'm sure there's going to be a wide selection of blockers. Maybe I can tell you a little bit about the blockers that I have, a mindset of keeping up with the pace of change. One, it's just so fast, and two, much like my own learners, I find it difficult to make time for my own learning and self-direct my own learning sometimes, since there's no one to help me on it. So I think we're going to be digging into some of those common challenges. I can see we've got some answers coming in already. So time, we're too busy, definitely resonates. Culture, we lack the support to innovate. That's really interesting. I'd love to hear what Michelle says about that lack of support. And then mindset, how we think. So that's generally what we're going to be focusing on as well. So thank you so much for your answers. We're going to be keeping this poll open for a while. Please do feel free to answer the poll. Use the question feature if you have a question, and please use the chat feature as well if you're feeling talkative and you want to chat with Michelle, with William, or each other throughout the course of the webinar. And then we'll be speaking to some of those comments at the end, I'm sure. So
I see a few people who I'm familiar with here, which is always nice.
Good, nice to see some familiar faces. You brought your fan club, Michelle, which is great.
And some brand new names as well. So hi everyone, it's lovely to be here for today's chat.
I'm looking forward to it. So I think we're coming up on the hour now. So even if not everyone's quite here, I think we're good to get started with the introductions maybe. My name is Cassandra Naji. I am the Director of Learning and Development at a marketing agency, and I'm going to be hosting this whole series of webinars from collaborative learning platform Eduflow. And the theme for the whole series is, if this is work, then what does learning look like now? And in each webinar, I'll be in conversation with thought leaders in instructional design and workplace learning, talking to the pace of change that we've all experienced in the last couple of years, not just in L&D, but in the workplace in general. I'm really digging into the challenges and the opportunities that pace of change has created for all of us. We also have William Cronier there behind the Eduflow logo. I'm sure many of you know William from our free Eduflow Academy courses. He's going to be making sure that the webinar runs smoothly today, and he'll be popping in and out of the chat and the questions as well. So thank you so much, William. And of course, we've got today's guest, the wonderful Michelle Ockers. Over the next 30 minutes or so, Michelle and I are going to be talking to the compelling case for becoming learning enablers rather than controlling learning in the workplace. And in particular, we'll be looking at the mindset shift that we need to make as learning professionals to become successful learning enablers. And what I really want to do is niche down into the steps involved in transforming one's own mindset. It's easy to say, but it's hard to kind of figure out how we transform our mindset. So I'd really like to come away with like an action plan for maybe what steps we could all take next to transform our mindsets. And I think Michelle is the perfect person to speak to this transformational L&D mindset. She's an organizational learning and modern workplace learning practitioner who's worked with companies on their L&D strategies. Companies like Qantas, Asahi, National Australia Bank, New Zealand Transport Association, and many, many others. And with these organizations and others like them, she creates and implements L&D strategies. She helps teams transform their mindsets and builds holistic learning cultures with them. She does this through Learning Uncut, which is the consultancy that she founded. And that might sound familiar to you because she has a podcast of the same name, which has had over 100,000 downloads in 100 countries, which is huge, huge achievement. On top of that, in 2019, she was awarded Learning Professional of the Year through the AITD. and she was awarded the Internet Time Alliance J. Cross Memorial for contribution to the field of informal learning. A real decorated superstar with us here today. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you for the introduction. It's always a little, imposter syndrome is a wrong word, right? Because I learned so much through my connection with others. I learned so much through my work with organisations. I've learned so much through my conversations with podcast guests. And I know when I received the L&D Professional of the Year for the Australian Institute of Training and Development, which is about contribution to the practice of L&D, I said at the time, and I still feel very strongly, some of these awards, they're given to individuals, but no one stands on their own, right? It's all about the community and the network we build around us. And it's always a pleasure to be able to interact with other learning and development professionals in all sorts of forums, in all sorts of ways. And we'll be talking about that today. So it's nice, as I said, to see both some familiar faces or names here today and some new people. And I think there's people from countries that I've not had the opportunity to interact with live before, from the Ukraine, for instance, and from Finland. So it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity. So thank you for inviting me to take part in the conversation today.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Okay, so I want to start maybe with a quick context question before we get into the meat of those mindset changes. So why does this pace of change in the workplace mean we need to focus on enabling, not controlling learning?
Because it's too hard to keep up. It's too hard to stay ahead of the game. We've got a limited capacity as a learning and development team. And what might have worked 10 or 15 years ago in terms of creating courses, and if we were really progressive, having a resource-led learning and development strategy, is simply too slow because things are moving too quickly for us to be able to support our people to adapt. The other reason is, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about this potentially, this idea of connecting people and learning happening in the spaces between people, which is a fundamental part of learning culture. I think what we're seeing increasingly, I think it was a trend that was underway pre-COVID, but we're seeing it more and more, is people are hungry for connection, for a sense of belonging, to find their space, to make a contribution. So one of our key roles now in learning and development is not just to create knowledge-led or skill-led courses led by experts, but to find ways to connect people, to help them connect to relevant others, to connect with relevant resources, and to contribute, to sense make together and to create new knowledge together, because any other way is just too slow. Having said that, I'm a big fan of the and mindset, rather than, it's not that courses are dead and training no longer has a place. It's approaching it in terms of what's going to suit the particular context and the particular purpose. But I think any learning and development strategy, organisational learning strategy, which still places learning and development as the gatekeeper and the source of all learning rather than the enabler and the connector, simply will not help the organisation and its people keep abreast of change.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that's something that people like Josh Burson have been beating the drum on for quite a while, on the invisible L&D mindset, things like that. And I think there is an unacknowledged رole that L&D has been playing over the past 2 years, which has been a social cohesion role. And I think we've seen people asking for trainings to be synchronous, where previously when we saw people in our social lives, they were asynchronous and folks were happy with that. And we've kind of filled a little bit of that social gap, I think. And that's been important in a way that perhaps we haven't always acknowledged. Okay, so it's just moving too fast.
Can I pick up on your invisible L&D thing from Josh Burson? Because I remember when that came out a few years ago, and I looked at that and I thought, I get what he's saying, right? That our job is not to be in the center of everything. And he may have used an electricity analogy that, electricity powers the organization or powers buildings and so on, but you don't see it. That's a really threatening analogy, the idea of invisible L&D, right? Because we want our contribution to be acknowledged. We want to have a position of credibility so we can contribute more in the organisation. I heard a really beautiful alternative analogy from one of my podcast guests, someone who I'm a huge fan of. It's Cassie Naji from Decium. And I'll just mention to people that we're going to put together a list of resources. So we're keeping note of anything I mention. So I will put that podcast episode with Christina into, or we'll put some resources out for you. But Christina talked about an analogy of glue. That, you know, we can be the glue that holds things together, the glue that connects things. But when it's done its job, if we're doing our job well as glue, connecting things across the organisation, it's not visible. You know, we can be the glue, we can be acknowledged as having provided the glue and helping things stick together and helping to connect things, but it's like frictionless almost. So I really liked her analogy around glue rather than invisible L&D, which just never caught on, despite it coming from Josh.
Yeah, and we actually call it frictionless L&D at my workplace as well. So I think that feels a little bit better for a lot of us. Okay, so that's an interesting sort of sideline on how threatening it can be to live through change and see the reception to our departments changed. So maybe that's one of the blockers we could bring out. What are the biggest blockers to L&D teams keeping up with the pace of change? Maybe one of them is that it's scary and threatening and we lose a bit of our status. Can you speak to any others you've heard from people?
I think that question around identity is tied up with mindset as well, how we see ourselves, how we think about ourselves and our role, and we're going to talk a little bit about thinking habits, I think, in a little while. So mindset is definitely part of it. I think the poll results are being shown now. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see that one of the biggest ones, and it always comes up whenever we talk about keeping abreast of the pace of change, no matter who you are or what kind of professional role you have. Time is always a real challenge, right? And this whole idea of we're too busy. And I like to reframe that around prioritization and habits, and putting in place habits which help us to keep abreast of change, rather than it being so overwhelming. And some of those habits and routines are practices for monitoring the environment for change, small practice around building our network out. And some of those require skills as well. So I noticed that a smaller number of people picked capability. We don't have the skills, but the kind of skills we're talking about in terms of understanding and making sense of change are things like knowing how to use machine and human filters through our networks to monitor what's going on in the industry and in the world of work, and making it a practice to put a little bit of time on a daily basis, even if it's just 15 minutes, to fine tune, for instance, our LinkedIn feed and figure out who's sharing good resources, not just in our domain, like in L&D, but outside of the domain as well, and to go in and take a look regularly, or using a tool like Feedly and developing good curation habits, so that it's not so time consuming. So it's about putting these practices in place. There's a guy called Mike Taylor, who I did interview on the podcast as well, who's got some really solid practices. He's really fine tuned, and he's a good example to learn from how you can set this stuff up so that it's a small touch every day rather than being this really overwhelming thing. And Harold Jarkey, I don't know, some people will be familiar. I'm just going to type his name in the chat because it's an unusual spelling. And his website is literally, I think, jarkey.com. He talks about personal knowledge mastery as a practice, which he breaks down into 3 steps: seek, sense, share. So seeking out information, which is about reaching out, or setting these filters up so things are coming to us to understand what is going on in the world around us, and then doing some sort of sense making, which I'll pick up in a moment, and sharing with our community. So those practices and habits and routines, I think, are the way to address time, but we do have a bit of a blocker about time. There's that whole idea of paying yourself first, right? And that's the investment in ourselves. I like to talk about drinking our own champagne when it comes to continuous learning. You know, if we're not role modeling it, if we're not putting in these continuous learning skills to keep pace with change, who else is going to do it if we're not doing the role modeling? So I think there's 2 aspects to it, and we'll talk about some of these other blockers. We've talked about time, we've talked a little bit about capability and some of the skills which maybe we need to think about for doing that seeking in particular. There's kind of two aspects. One is understanding what's happening in the world of work, inside and outside the organisation. And then the other is about doing something with it so that our practices and our projects, our contribution to the organisation is helping keep up with the pace of change. So we've spoken a little bit about what might get in the way of that external seeking and sense making. But then there's the internal piece, which is kind of about being in the know about what's happening in your organisation, right? And that's about building relationships and building our credibility. So again, allocating some time to sustaining relationships, keeping abreast of things like, you know, organisational updates, KPI packs. It can be easy not to make that important, and we can lose a lot. But certainly building relationships and having credibility so people share with us what's happening and people think to include us. And I guess that's partly the culture piece there, lacking the support to innovate, because the more we can build our credibility, the more we can strengthen our relationships, the more likely people are to go with us when we say, let's try a different approach. So that kind of trust is built with little steps. And I think change happens like one conversation at a time, one little stretch outside of the comfort zone at a time. I think there are still some organisations, obviously people here are struggling with the organisational culture piece. I think that as a barrier has dropped quite a bit in the early part of COVID in particular, although we're seeing a little bit of refreezing, I think, in some organisations. But people, I think, are definitely across organisations more open to trying different things because of that whole COVID experience and the massive rate at which we all had to adapt to that. Then I think the second part of keeping abreast of change, and it ties in with this idea of sense making. It's one thing to know what's going on, to hear about different practices, to maybe listen to like the case studies I share on the podcast. It's another thing to do something with it. And we have to take action to really make sense of things and to figure out what may and may not work. And I think, again, sometimes it's we feel like we lack the support to try something different. And I think sometimes we maybe talk ourselves out of it a little bit as well. But I think a lot of it starts with thinking habits, which is mindset. I did a piece of research that I put together. I've got a partnership with Laura Overton, who some people may know, and Shannon Tipton from Learning Rebels in the US. And about June 2020, when we started thinking about how do we emerge out of COVID, and look at us here, still figuring it all out. But we started a series of conversations in a podcast series called Learning Uncut Emergent, where we were asking the question, how can L&D take advantage of the current period of time to emerge stronger and smarter? And one of the themes that really pulled out of that, I think we had something like 32 guests across 16 episodes. So there were quite a lot of rich conversations, but this idea about mindset and the thinking habits that we need to bring to the table, which are kind of those tendencies or perspectives we commonly bring to who we are, to what our role is, to how we need to work with other people in the organisation, and to trying new things, from, you know, being willing to let go. And I think that's part of the adaptation as well, not just sticking to what's always worked, but being willing to experiment.
So I think for me, if I can, while you were talking, I was kind of thinking of 3 key steps that if we want to walk away from this webinar, maybe we implement as professionals. One is kind of systems-based, where maybe we invest some time up front in setting up systems that allow us to receive relevant information, something like Feedly or Smart Filters or Google Alerts that allow information to come to us in a way that we control, so that we have that at our fingertips. And then maybe the second step is becoming a little bit better in metacognition and thinking, well, how is this resource, podcast episode, whatever, useful to me in my context? And one thing that I found really helpful with that is when I read something or listen to something, I draw a square, a triangle, and a circle down the side of it. And I think, how does the idea in here square with what I think about L&D? How does it not fit, like the scientific symbol for change, the triangle? How does it change what I thought? And then how am I going to go forward and evolve the circle going forward? So just that small act of metacognition with everything that I react with, I think kind of helps me with your part of do something about it. Like, how does this fit in with what I need to do? And then maybe the due diligence part, fitting it into your work in the workplace. I think that's a behavior change thing where we now know what we need to do as L&D professionals if we interact with the resources. The next step is doing it. And a big part, I think, of behavior change, as we saw in our last webinar with Julie Dirksen, is one, modeling. Like, then becomes our responsibility to model that for other folks in the organization and incentivize ourselves almost. How can we set our own OKRs around evolving and getting a better L&D mindset? How can we reward ourselves and make that part of the plan? So that kind of feels like something we could go out of this and say, right, I'm going to set up these systems, I'm going to improve my metacognition, and then I'm going to incentivize myself to change this mindset.
So I hadn't come across the square, triangle, circle. I've just written that down. That is a great little nudge, which kind of fits the idea of nudge, fits with the idea of behavior change, right? And we talk a lot more about behavioral science now than we did, say, 2, 3, 4 years ago as part of our toolkit and our approach and how we think about our work, that we're in the business of behavior change. So again, drinking our own champagne. And we know a lot now about habit formation, right? We've got some fantastic people who've worked on habit formation. I really like Atomic Habits from James Clear. And he uses, is it from him or is it, it might be from the nudge unit, the behavioural nudge unit in the UK. The idea of the EAST framework, make it easy, attractive, social and timely.
I like that.
So if people haven't come across that, the EAST framework, look that up because it's a really good way to think about if I want to build a habit of regularly like staying abreast of change and spending a little bit of time scanning the environment, how can I make it easy, attractive, social, so I'm sharing with others or I'm setting up an accountability buddy, and timely, maybe it's like 15 minutes a day, and like don't make it overwhelming. Whatever you try, just baby steps that just accumulate, right?
I think so, yeah. Baby steps are the way to go with these kind of behavior changes.
Yeah.
And I think maybe we need to zoom out a little bit now actually and say, like, can we give a name to this mindset that we need to have? Is it transformational? Is it business first? Is it invisible? Maybe that's a bit scary. How would you characterize this mindset that we're aiming for in our workplace at the moment?
I don't like putting one word on it because this idea of mindset, I like to think about thinking habits, the way we think about things, those tendencies, the perspectives, the lenses that we look at things through. And I think there's never one mindset. We talk about growth mindset a lot with people. What mindset do we? Oh, well, we need a growth mindset. Yes, a growth mindset. But let's also think about the way we view ourselves, as I said before, the way we view our interactions with others, the way we, potentially think about, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about business value versus learning value and the kind of business first, the way we think about our own identity. So I think it's more complex than saying one label. You can kind of group it together and label it maybe by the objective, which is to transform our practices, to build our impact. I've been doing a more recent podcast series again with Laura and Shannon, which we've called the Emergent Bold Action series. So we've been really curious about what is it that makes some learning and development professionals bolder than others, that allows them to step out of their comfort zone, to challenge, to bring in new ways of working, new ideas to their work. So we've been exploring the core strengths that L&D professionals need to take bold action. So there's this, and we've sort of identified around that, ways of thinking about community and building your safety net, about resilience. So there's kind of like a whole stack of thinking habits, but there's one particular resource which I'll provide to share, which was 5 new thinking habits for a smarter, stronger L&D, where we really we nailed it down to thinking business first rather than learning first, thinking of yourself as an empathic explorer rather than a knowledgeable expert, that you're there to explore and to co-create, which leads into interdependence, that you need to work interdependently with others rather than be the expert. Looking at acting now. So where do you need to act with speed and agility versus where do you need to slow down? So being able to bring that mindset about time, and then that whole one around innovation, which is really critical of not allowing our future actions just to be determined by past successes, but being willing to let go of things where they're maybe not suitable anymore or suitable for the context. So there's kind of a set of thinking habits rather than it being one big habit is the way I would frame it.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I'd really, in a minute, I'd like to go into this business first mindset and say, like, what does it actually look like? What does it entail doing? First, I'll tell a little story about the growth mindset. At where I work at the marketing agency, one of our core values used to be relentless growth. And that was kind of directed towards personal growth, professional growth and stuff. But actually people found it a little bit overbearing and overwhelming, this sense of relentless growth. And we had a lot of comments like growth is seasonal. Maybe I'm in a non-growth period. Maybe it's winter for my growth tree, things like this. And so we evolved it into curiosity, which to me feels less kind of aggressively linear and feels like it encompasses the sense of learning involving some like infertile periods, some periods of rest and recuperation. So we're in a curiosity mindset rather than a growth mindset. And I think that's worked a lot better for us. So as an L&D person in this kind of context, I often feel a little bit scared about whether my business acumen is up to snuff, whether I have enough of a business first mindset. So can you tell me maybe what, in a learning professional, what does a business first mindset look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point there, when you were talking about relentless growth and growth mindset, I was thinking about Novartis and the work they've done with curiosity as a core value, right? And for anyone who's not aware of it, I'd recommend Simon Brown, who's the CLO at Novartis, is one of the authors, but there's another couple of authors. The Curious Advantage is a really good exploration of what can curiosity look like at different scales. And I think that being curious is a key part of staying abreast of change as well and applying it. So business first. When we think about and talk about how we add value and what our purpose is, and when we talk about the outcomes of our work to other people, we often talk about it in terms of learning value. So we talk about, activity, engagement with our courses, we look at the stats around access to resources and so on. We may even look at the growth in knowledge and skill. But if none of that is actually what the organisation needs to solve business problems, to help seize business opportunities, then it hasn't added business value. So thinking business first is around looking at seeing your value first in solving business problems. So when something is presented to you, when you're asked to help with something in your organisation or you see an opportunity, it's sort of, there's on a spectrum. Learning value is important, but it's got to back into or back off business value. So looking first at what's the business problem, what's the business opportunity, what's the business need, and having smarter upfront conversations with stakeholders. And I think that's a key behaviour that we would see if you were using a business first mindset, is having different kinds of conversations around, well, what is the, how will you know if this has been successful? What's the underlying business challenge or issue that you're trying to address or the opportunity you're trying to seize? And then gradually backing off that conversation. You get good metrics out of that as well. When I was at Coca-Cola Amatil, I had really good senior leadership support, which of course I'd worked for and set up. But I actually had a rule in place. If someone came to me and wanted me to work on something or allocate resource from the team, if they couldn't clearly define what the business outcome was going to be, and I would often have to help them to try to figure that out. Even senior leaders sometimes, I wasn't going to allocate any resource to it because I was a steward of the organisation's resources. And you only have so much capacity in your team. You only have so much budget. There's only so many things you can do. So this, where can we make the most impact in the business? Sometimes that's to help the business evolve in the future. And, future skills is a really important area for us to be playing in at the moment, and thinking about equipping our organisation, our people, to adapt to change when we don't know what the future is going to look like, and it's increasingly uncertain. So adaptability is important. But nonetheless, thinking first, what's the business value in the work I'm thinking about doing, or the work I've been asked to do, and then saying, okay, and there's some really great metrics frameworks available now that help you then to sort of say, okay, well, if that's the business value and that's kind of the business outcome, how do we then work backwards to say, here's what learning value will look like, and here's the learning metrics. And then you kind of continue the conversation with the business around what's happening with performance as we increasingly work over time on learning experiences and more comprehensive solutions that might involve things that aren't learning as well, right? So it's that idea of interdependence. And we know that there's many levers for behaviour change and performance improvement. And even if learning is one of them, it's often not the only one. And that's part of our role as well when we're thinking business first. Who else in the business can help get this outcome? Who do I need to partner with and draw in? That's kind of, so some of those behaviours, asking smarter questions, having better conversations, looking across the organisation as to who else can help to solve this problem. And then when we evaluate, not just evaluating our work to demonstrate, aren't we good, we delivered X, Y, Z, or we got this outcome, but evaluating throughout the period in which we're rolling out sustaining, supporting solutions to understand what is happening and using it like for continuous improvement. Mm-hmm. How, are we hitting the mark or not? What adjustments can we make? So tracking success and adapting rather than just demonstrating at the end, here's the outcome, and building your own credibility because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate to bring in a buzzword, but that sounds like the agile way of working rather than being waterfall and saying, well, this is what happened at the end, continually iterating on our L&D projects based on the data as it's coming out. One thing that I have to do as a one-person L&D team is just focus on one metric. I use the growth hacking framework of the one metric that matters, the OMTM. So I just focus on one metric, and it's got to be a business metric. Like the main metric that I report on for my L&D projects has nothing to do with learner engagement or uptake or anything like that. It's how are we directly impacting the bottom line of the business. So trying to really put that creative constraint to myself and have one key metric that I speak to.
That's really interesting. There's a lady called Beth Hall, who's an Australian learning and development professional who was leading Cotton On Group, who are a retail group. She was leading their learning and development, and her one key metric was internal fill rate, which I loved. So are we growing our people to the point where they're competitive for promotion? And filling our talent pipeline rather than having to go external. I thought that was an amazing metric to use.
That's really cool. That really speaks to the progress of the business, doesn't it?
One
question I really want to ask you is I know that you speak a lot to perhaps mental models for learning and development professionals, and that's something I am interested in, and I do regular tweet storms about breaking down mental models. So maybe you can tell us how mental models benefit L&D. What are the most useful mental models that we could be applying to our work?
Yeah, they help us to see things differently and to learn from other domains, kind of in a nutshell. So a mental model is just a representation, a concept, a framework that helps us to quickly understand ourselves and the world around us. And people may be familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work around fast and slow thinking. And I think fast thinking got a bad rap for a while. It's that habitual quick thinking we do, but mental models really help us with both the fast thinking and the slower thinking, and both have a role to play. We need to take shortcuts because we're doing so much thinking, we have so much information coming at us, so many decisions to make in a day, that these mental models, these simplified representations or frameworks, help us to make decisions more readily. They help us with repeatability. So something like, the ADDIE framework in itself is a mental model about how we should go about doing instruction design, or the alternative might be the SAM, successive approximation model. I'm not sure that SAM really took off, but Megan Torrance has one called Llama. Looks a lot like agile methodology, I think it's called. She's managed to hack it into Llama. So that might be an example we'd be familiar with. But equally, we can tap into wisdom and best practices from other domains. Now, I mentioned EAST before, that easy, attractive, social, timely is a behavioural change model. That's a mental model. That's a shortcut that can be quite useful. They help us to experiment and try new approaches as well, so we can pick up things from other domains. A good example I like to use is when we think about marketing and what we've picked up from marketing. We picked up mental models from marketing, things like personas, things like empathy maps. I use in my strategy work a value proposition canvas, which I've adapted and adopted from business strategy into learning strategy. You know, these are all examples of mental models to help us think a little differently, maybe see our work a little differently. And I'm just going to pop up modelthinkers.com is one place you can go to. Obviously, you need to put the HTTPS in front of it, but they have a vast library of mental models, and they put out a model of the week. And they put out little playbooks of models. Now, there's quite a lot they give away for free, but then you can also go to a subscribe membership, which is not very expensive. And they take, thank you, William, for putting in the full link. They take a lot of the hard work out of thinking differently, even how to run an experiment, innovation models. You know, these can help us take a lot of the hard, heavy lifting out of how might I do something in the research. So that's an awesome resource, Model Thinkers.
Thank you so much for sharing. I wasn't aware of that, and I'm going to go and check that out. I'm a big fan of these mental models. One that I've started using is Kahneman's decision-making framework, where every time we have to make a decision, it's just a simple template for noting down what the decision is, what are the possible second order, first order and second order effects, how we feel when we make the decision, and what we think will happen. And then in 3 months' time, we're meant to go back to this template and say, did what I predicted happen? And how can I use this information to improve my decision-making process? So how often was I right? Did my feelings about the decision correlate with the eventual outcome? Was I nervous about it and it did go wrong? Things like this. So trying to improve your metacognition around the decisions that you take as an L&D professional, and then look back at them and say, right, how can I take that forward to make these better decisions in the future? I think that's an interesting way to leverage them as well.
They're really good ways to improve our thinking and our decision-making using, even, you know, Cassie, that the square, triangle, circle, that's a mental model, right?
Exactly, yeah. I love it because it's so simple as well.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to ask you, Michelle, before we open up for questions is you were in the Royal Australian Air Force for 16 years. And a bit of a coincidence, I was also an Air Force cadet, but at school. So I piloted planes and shot 2.2 rifles and stuff. And so how did that pivot to L&D, and how does having that mindset from the RAF impact your mindset at work? Did it change you in any way?
Look, the positives and negatives, right? So the Air Force invests, I mean, what does the military exist for? Well, in a country like Australia, where we're not kind of, we get involved in a bit in peacemaking making missions or in overseas deployments, but it's really, we train for the possibility that we end up in conflict. So the military is just a big training machine. And they invest really heavily in training and in growth. And as I was a logistics officer in the Air Force, I worked on some really big projects, like one to introduce a new fleet of aircraft to service. And my job was to make sure we could support it. And one element was training. But when I left the Air Force in 2000, I sort of sat back and thought, out of all of the things I've done, what's brought me most joy? And the thing that had brought me most joy was seeing people grow. And I just thought I really want to lean more into that. But the pivot point for me into learning and development was my project management skills. Project management is an awesome set of transferable skills that you can use to turn to just about anything. So I use that project management to pivot into training projects on big telecommunications projects. So the structure stood me in good stead on these big formal projects, but eventually I had a stack of stuff I had to unlearn about training versus learning, right? Because it was all about control and structure and repeatability and the right way to do things. And you know, when I started moving outside of those big sort of engineering disciplines, it wasn't fit for purpose anymore. It wasn't the approaches that what I'd sort of picked up from the Air Force was too slow, too structured, too gated, and I had to unlearn a stack of stuff. And you know, in 2014, I'd been going to conferences for a little while, and I got sick of hearing people saying, "Who's on Twitter?" And like, you get this little handful of people in an auditorium who would say, "I'm on Twitter." And, you know, I kind of put my hand up because I had a Twitter account, but I had no idea how to use it. And, you know, I just got to the point of all these people are saying you should be on Twitter because it's an awesome learning tool. So I started following Jane Hart from the Centre for Modern Workplace Learning. And I did one of her programs called Becoming a Social Learning Practitioner. And I learned how to use Twitter. I learned how to start blogging. I learned how to grow a network. And I discovered this whole new world of stuff, which was a million miles away from the Air Force. And I realized how much I had to unlearn. And, you know, people like Jane Hart, John Stepper and his Working Out Loud approach, Harold Jarkey and Personal Knowledge Mastery, they showed me how to start bringing in different approaches and really challenged my thinking about what works with learning, and that it's just not all about structure and training. Again, the and mindset, but I credit that sort of getting out of that structured way of thinking, learning to think more fluidly, learning to think about connection and networks and connecting people, tapping into experience and giving people a voice in learning rather than all being didactic. That was really transformative for me and has shaped things into the future. So people who like structure love working with me because I still carry that structure. But I would say, you know, I've learned a lot more about learning since leaving the Air Force than I actually did in the Air Force.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that certainly resonates a little bit. I want to open up the floor to questions from anyone who's listening. Maybe you can drop your questions in the chat or use the question feature, both the same. William and I and Michelle, of course, are monitoring for if there's any questions that come up. Michelle, maybe I can ask you a final question while people think of something to ask and drop it in there. We've talked a little bit about social learning, and I wonder, quite often on social networks, we end up in echo chambers where everyone kind of has the same approach as us, whether that's to politics or L&D or anything else. How can we create or find fruitful spaces where we can have perhaps conversations where we differ with people about an L&D approach or an idea and still have a good relationship? How can we have that kind of debate relationship in social media with other professionals?
I think it's really hard to do in social media, to have respectful, inquiring differences of opinion. I think at some point you need to take it into private communities. There's someone I follow, and anyone in Australia I think will be aware of him, Arun Pradhan, ARUN. He's actually one of the people behind Model Thinkers. I'll just pop his name in here because people may be able to look him up on Twitter or on LinkedIn. He talks about using Twitter. I mean, Twitter and LinkedIn are really different beasts. And, you know, Twitter is a bit more of a free-for-all than LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a lot more professional, but he deliberately crafts who he follows on Twitter to get diverse voices in there, to catch different opinions. So creating that diversity. But then I think it's too easy for people to shout us down, not so much on LinkedIn. I think there's a greater level of respect because it's a more professional space. But even so, I think ultimately finding private communities and private networks where you can lean into differences is really healthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. It's really difficult. One thing that I try and bring to my social media life, which is not very, I'm not on social media a lot, but one thing I try and remember is the scout versus soldier mindset, which is something that Julia Guerin has thought about a lot, which is, are we coming in as a soldier defending our position and our opinions, or are we coming in as a scout and sort of doing a recce and saying, right, what are all the different opinions here and how does that fit in with mine, and how could I agree or disagree with these in a sort of curious way? So thinking before you check into social media, what's my mindset here and what do I need to get out of this? Is it scout or soldier? Which I thought was quite useful, and another mental model that we've been talking about. Okay, I see we've got a question in the chat from Yishan Chan. says, my question is around influencing senior leaders. How do we influence senior leaders to translate their buy-in on a learning culture and bring that to life through org design, particularly org design around ensuring teams are supported through both central and decentralized learning support?
That's a big question, Ishan. Thank you very much. So this idea of learning culture and building learning culture is one that I spend quite a bit of time on. To build learning culture right across an organisation, you can build it in pockets where you've got the right conditions, but for learning culture to truly flourish, which is about, you know, and when I talk about learning culture, I'm not just talking about people self-directing, lots of individuals learning. We're talking about people being connected across the organisation and learning together, sharing things, bringing in ideas, approaches from outside and circling them around the organisation, doing something with them together to create new knowledge, to create growth and progress. So you can have lots of individuals learning, but really you're not getting the benefit of organisational learning or the application of new ways of working and so on. To get that kind of knowledge sharing and collaboration and exploration, experimentation happening, there's like a whole stack of conditions that have to be in place in the organisation. To Ishan's point, you know, you need trust primarily. That's the first one. Without trust, who's going to be willing to experiment? Who's going to be willing to share their knowledge if there's not an environment of trust? And of course, there's a lot of work around psychological safety and how to build psychological safety, and leaders are really critical in that. We need some sense of empowerment so people feel able to try things, able to make decisions. You know, that not everything has to be deferred up, and, you know, there's some flexibility. So a sense of accountability is important. So it's these conditions, and ultimately our leaders shape those conditions. And the work of their org design teams is also to build culture, understanding a whole range of levers, which include the role of senior leaders in their role modelling, in the way they make decisions, which creates the environment which either hinders learning, true organisational learning and learning culture, or helps it to flourish. So I think org design teams are really critical, and learning and development, you can't build learning culture alone. There's just a limit to how far you can take it, because it is not something that's actually separate to the organisational culture. You know, we talk about risk culture and safety culture and learning culture and this culture and that culture as if they're separate things, like there's this pie and you've got slices, a slice of blueberry and a slice of apricot. So, well, you don't. You've just got this culture, these ways of behaving, ways of acting in the organisation that promote or inhibit different things, and learning is one of those things. So I think org design is critical around, you know, the values we set, even around structures. And if you think about agile structures, and if you can knock down silos and make the boundaries more porous, both between people in the organisation and the external world, which is, you know, sometimes about policy and practice around technology. There's all these different levers that are important. So that's the org design part of it, and how critical that is, and for us to build our partnerships with org design. But then I think that's one part of the question. I'm just reading the question again. The other part is around influencing senior leaders. At the end of the day, the question is, what's your value proposition? You know, what's the compelling reason that senior leaders would want to build, to allow a learning culture to build? So how do you frame that and pitch that, understanding who influences senior leaders, who do they listen to? So that's partly around that ear to the ground thing, and knowing what they're focused on, what's important to them. If innovation is important to them, if growth is important to them, bringing in examples of other organisations that through learning have created growth, I mean, Satya Nadella from Microsoft is a classic example, and he talks about a cultural-led renewal of Microsoft. Who wouldn't want to be, as a senior leader, experiencing the kind of growth that Microsoft's been experiencing, right? So it's about the storytelling and looking for examples, finding out who your senior leaders admire, what other organisations might they want to be like, and what are the learning practices there, and hopefully finding some good, solid learning practices that you can sort of bring it back to them. If you want to be like whoever, if you want to be like, a Microsoft, here's some of the things that happen in Microsoft around culture and learning and where learning fits in, that helps them to adapt and to grow. So it's getting into the mindset, the headset of the senior leaders, and what are they going to respond to? What's important to them? And how can learning, again, thinking business first, how can learning help contribute to their goals rather than learning for the sake of itself?
And I think we can sort of boil that down into 3 steps just to finish up. I know we're a little bit over, but maybe the 3 steps that we can draw out of that for you, Shan, is find out what keeps the senior leadership up at night. And it's going to be a business metric. Probably. So we go back to that business first mindset, what keeps them up at night? And then who do they listen to, both inside and outside the organization? Who do they admire, and who are their sources of information in the organization? And then maybe mirroring the narrative and the vernacular that that the leadership has back to them in a way that advocates for L&D. So talking about the metrics and the challenges that resonate with them, and then speaking about L&D within that context and how it can contribute to that. So mirroring that narrative in a way that really mirrors their own and therefore resonates with them a little bit. Michelle, we're 3 minutes over time. I'm sorry, just so much to talk about. I feel like we could have gone on all day about that. I'm really grateful for your time. Reminding everyone, do you want to tell everyone your website and the podcast?
Yes, the website is learninguncut.global, and lots of resources there. And of course, I named the business after the podcast. Rather than the other way around. No, it's just interesting. I've been looking for a good business name for a while, and Learning Uncut seemed to stick with people, and they just like I just appreciate all of the guests who come on to share case studies about their work. We have people doing really amazing stuff. Some of it's innovative and new, some of it's more traditional but just done really well, and there's lots of great examples to draw on. So it's just such a delight to be able to share these stories.
Well, it's been a delight to have you and to hear them. Thank you so much. And I'd love to keep the conversation going on social media, in the Circle group, or on Eduflow's LinkedIn or Twitter, and just to keep talking through these ideas. Thank you so much, all of you, for attending. Thank you, William, for helping us keep everything on track. And thank you, Michelle. I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to be part of the conversation.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.